The alarm in my chest came before the alarm in the room. I did not know why my hearts had started beating faster. Nothing had happened yet. Professor Orun was still talking in his slow, dry voice about a theory that every cadet in the Interstellar Defense Academy had learned to laugh at. And yet something in the air had changed, like the moment before a storm touches the ground. My name is Kestra Vel. I am a Threlian, born on a world where the weather is gentle, and the biggest danger you might face in a lifetime is a bad harvest season. I had joined the academy because my family had a long line of officers, and because I wanted to prove I could be one of them. I was not the bravest cadet in my class. I was not the smartest either. But I was careful, and careful cadets notice things that others miss. That morning, I noticed everything. We were sitting in the round lecture hall of Xenobiology 400, 40 cadets from 12 different species, all wearing the same gray academy uniform, all pretending to pay attention while secretly counting the minutes until the break. The subject that day was something called Deathworlder theory. It was not a real subject, not really. It was more like a ghost story that professors told to keep young cadets humble. Professor Orun stood at the front of the hall, his 4 eyes scanning the room the way they always did, like he was searching for someone who was not paying attention so he could make an example of them. He was old, older than most professors, and he had seen enough of the galaxy to be bored by almost everything in it. Deathworlder theory, he said, tapping a claw against the projection screen, is one of the oldest and most foolish ideas in xenobiology. It suggests that somewhere out there, a species could evolve on a world so hostile, so cruel, so relentlessly trying to kill everything on it, that the species itself would become something more dangerous than the world that made it. A few cadets chuckled. I did not. I was too busy writing notes, because even foolish theories showed up on exams. It is a scare story, Orun continued. Parents tell it to children. Old soldiers tell it around fires. It gives war stories a flavor of destiny. But there has never been a single confirmed death world in the galactic archive. Not one. Every planet capable of producing intelligent life has always stayed within a livable range. Gravity within a narrow band. Predators kept in check by ecosystems. Diseases that a species learns to survive alongside, not diseases that hunt them for millions of years without mercy. He smiled, the way professors smile when they think they are being clever. So, he said, looking around the room, is there anyone here whose homeworld would qualify? Anyone at all? It was a joke. Everyone understood it was a joke. The Velkarn cadet beside me actually laughed out loud, a short bark of amusement, because everyone knew the answer was no. Nobody's homeworld would qualify. We were all here, alive and calm, and sitting in comfortable chairs, which was proof enough that none of our worlds had ever tried very hard to kill us. That was when Mara Voss raised her hand. I want to describe that moment carefully because I have thought about it many times since, and I still remember exactly how it felt. She did not raise her hand quickly, the way a nervous cadet might raise a hand to answer a question and get it over with. She raised it slowly, calmly, the way someone might raise a hand to ask if they could be excused to get a glass of water. There was nothing dramatic in the gesture. That was what made it so strange. The room did not laugh. Not right away. For a few seconds, there was only silence, the kind of silence that comes when a joke suddenly stops being a joke, and nobody is sure what it has become instead. Mara sat 2 rows in front of me, on the left side of the hall, where the human cadets usually gathered together out of habit more than rule. She was not a large cadet. She was, if anything, smaller than average for her species, with short brown hair and a calm, steady expression that rarely changed no matter what was happening around her. In the months I had known her, I had seen her get top marks in tactics class, average marks in theory, and a reputation among the other cadets for being polite, quiet, and almost boringly normal. Nobody had ever pointed at Mara Voss and said, "There is something dangerous about that one." She helped injured cadets to the medical bay after training accidents. She shared her food rations when someone forgot theirs. She said thank you to the cleaning staff every single day, even though most cadets walked past them without a glance. And now her hand was in the air, steady as a support beam, while Professor Orun stared at her with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It was not anger, it was not amusement, it looked almost like fear, the kind of fear that comes from being asked a question you did not expect to actually need an answer for. "Cadet Voss," he said slowly, and his voice had lost its dry, bored tone. "You have a comment?" "Not a comment, sir," Mara said. Her voice was calm, the same voice she used to ask for the salt at mealtimes. "I think my homeworld might qualify." The Velkarn cadet who had laughed earlier stopped laughing. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper the word seriously, more of a question than a statement. I found myself leaning forward in my seat, my pen frozen above my notebook, my heart's beating faster even though nothing dangerous had happened, nothing at all, except for a quiet human cadet raising her hand in a lecture hall. Professor Orun blinked, all four eyes at once, which for a Threlian professor was the equivalent of a long, uncomfortable pause. "Explain," he said. Mara lowered her hand and folded them together on the desk in front of her, the way she always did when she was about to say something carefully thought out. "Earth has a gravity slightly higher than what most species here consider comfortable," she began. "Our atmosphere carries a level of oxygen that would be flammable in dangerous ways if certain conditions lined up. We have predators on every continent capable of killing an adult human without much effort, some of them nearly invisible until they are already attacking. We have diseases that have killed more humans throughout history than every war combined. We have weather events that can flatten cities in hours. And every single year, without fail, some part of our planet tries to end human life through fire, flood, freezing cold, or burning heat." She said all of this the way someone reads a grocery list. No drama, no pride, just facts, delivered flatly, like she was reading them off a card. The room had gone completely silent now. Even the cadets, who had been half asleep moments earlier, were sitting up straight, eyes fixed on her. "That does sound unpleasant," Professor Orun said carefully, "but unpleasant is not the same as Deathworld. Many planets have dangerous elements. The difference, Cadet Voss, is whether those elements combine into something that actively works against the survival of the dominant species, generation after generation, without pause." Mara nodded slowly, as if she had expected this exact response. "I understand the distinction, sir," she said. "I'm saying Earth crosses it." Nobody spoke. I glanced sideways at my Velkarn neighbor, whose laughter had turned into something closer to a nervous stillness, his tail curled tightly around the leg of his chair. Professor Orun stepped closer to where Mara sat, his long body moving with the slow, deliberate steps he used when he wanted to appear unbothered, even though I could tell, somehow, that he was very bothered indeed. "You understand," he said, "that if what you are describing is accurate, it would mean your species did not simply survive on a hostile world. It would mean you evolved because of that hostility. That every trait your species carries, every strength, every instinct, was shaped by a planet actively trying, every single day, to remove you from existence." "Yes, sir," Mara said. "That's what I'm saying." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was heavier. It pressed down on the room like a weight none of us had asked to carry. I looked around at the other cadets, species from a dozen different worlds, and I saw the same expression on nearly every face. It was the look of people realizing that a joke they had laughed at for years might not have been a joke at all. Professor Orun turned back toward the front of the hall, his four eyes distant, thinking. When he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of its earlier dryness. "Cadet Voss," he said quietly, "I would like you to stay after class. I have some questions I would like to ask you, privately, if you don't mind." "I don't mind, sir," Mara said. The bell for the end of the period rang a few minutes later, but almost nobody moved right away. Cadets who normally rushed out the door, the second class ended, sat frozen in their seats, glancing at Mara, then at each other, then back at Mara again. I stayed too, gathering my things slowly, watching her from the corner of my eye. She did not look proud. She did not look nervous either. She simply gathered her notebook, tucked it under her arm, and waited quietly, while the rest of us filed out, whispering to each other in voices too low for the professor to hear. I paused at the door for just a moment, looking back at her one more time. She was staring straight ahead, calm as ever, while Professor Orun rifled through a stack of old files at his desk. Files I would later learn were far older and far more important than any of us had realized. Something had shifted in that room. I did not understand it yet, not fully, but I understood enough to know that the story we had all grown up laughing at, the myth of the Death World and its terrible children, had just stopped being a myth. And whatever it had become instead was still sitting quietly in her seat, waiting for the professor to ask his questions, as calm as a species that had never once, in all its long and bloody history, been able to afford the luxury of panic. I walked out into the hallway with the rest of my class, and for the first time since I had arrived at the academy, I found myself afraid of something I could not name. I did not go far. I told myself I had left a data pad in the lecture hall, which was not entirely a lie, since I had genuinely forgotten it on my desk in the rush to leave. When I slipped back inside, quiet as I could manage, Professor Orun was already sitting across from Mara at the long instructor's desk, an old data terminal glowing between them. Neither of them noticed me at first. I found my data pad exactly where I remembered leaving it, and instead of picking it up right away, I crouched near the back row and listened. "I want to ask you plainly," Professor Orun said, "and I want you to answer just as plainly. Are you certain you are not exaggerating your homeworld's conditions? Cadets sometimes do this without meaning to. Homesickness can make a place seem larger than it is, more dangerous than it is, simply because you miss it." Mara considered the question for a moment, before answering. "I understand why you'd ask that, sir, but no, if anything, I'm probably making it sound less dangerous than it actually is. It's strange to explain Earth to people who didn't grow up there. Things that would sound frightening to you are just Tuesday to us." "Give me an example," the professor said. "Something ordinary, not a disaster, just an average day." Mara folded her hands the way she always did, before explaining something carefully. "An average day, for a human child, even now, with all our medicine and safety systems, still includes exposure to organisms that could end their life if left untreated. Small cuts can become infections that kill within days if nobody notices in time. Certain plants can poison you just by touching them. Insects smaller than my smallest finger can carry diseases that have wiped out large portions of our population throughout history. None of this is unusual to us. It's simply the world working as it always has. And your species continued to reproduce, to build, to advance, despite this constant threat." "We didn't advance despite it, sir," Mara said. "I think we advanced because of it." I saw Professor Orun's tail twitch, just slightly, the way it did when he was trying to hide that something had unsettled him. "Explain that distinction," he said. "A species that doesn't face real danger doesn't need to get smarter quickly," Mara said. "It doesn't need to work together in large groups just to survive the night. It doesn't need to invent tools out of desperation or develop language complex enough to warn each other about threats faster than instinct alone could manage. Our early ancestors weren't the strongest creatures on our planet. We weren't the fastest, or the best armored, or the most poisonous. We survived because we had no other choice but to become smarter than everything trying to kill us." The professor was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had a careful, measured quality, like a man walking across ice he was no longer sure would hold his weight. "There is a record," he said slowly, "buried deep enough in the Academy archive that most cadets never learn it exists. A record of a classification system, used briefly, generations ago, before it was quietly discontinued. I would like to show it to you, if you are willing to see it." "I'm willing," Mara said. He turned the terminal toward her, and though I could not see the screen from where I crouched, I saw the light of it reflected in her calm, steady eyes. She read whatever was there without any change in her expression, the same patient stillness she always carried, even as the professor watched her reaction like he was watching a bomb that had not yet decided whether to detonate. "This says nothing about a specific species," Mara said after a while. "Just a category, a warning label without a name attached." "Correct," Orun said. "The category was created after several encounters, long before the Academy was founded, with worlds that defense forces at the time refused to approach without extreme caution. The details were never widely shared. Some believed sharing them would cause panic. Others believed the encounters were exaggerated, folded into legend the way old stories always are. Eventually, the classification was folded into what we now teach as Deathworlder theory, a myth for cadets, safely distant from anything real." "But it wasn't distant," Mara said. "It was not quite a question." "No," the professor admitted. "I do not think it was." I shifted my weight, and my boot scraped softly against the floor. Both of them turned toward the sound at once, and I froze, caught somewhere between standing up straight and pretending I had never been there at all. "Cadet Vel," Professor Orun said, not unkindly, "I take it you forgot something." "My datapad, sir," I said, holding it up as if it were proof of my innocence. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to listen." He studied me for a moment, his 4 eyes unreadable, and then, to my surprise, he gestured toward an empty chair near the desk. "Sit, if you like," he said. "Perhaps it is useful for another cadet to hear this. You will likely have questions of your own soon enough, once the rest of the class begins to talk." I sat, feeling strangely honored and deeply uneasy at the same time, the datapad clutched tightly in my hands. "Cadet Voss," the professor continued, turning back to Mara, "I would like to understand more about how your species behaves under pressure. Not statistics, not history. I want to understand the instinct itself. When something threatens you directly, immediately, what happens inside a human?" Mara was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right words to describe something she had never needed to explain before. "It's hard to describe simply," she said. "There's a kind of calm that comes over you. Not the absence of fear, but fear that has been put to work instead of allowed to freeze you. Your senses sharpen. Time seems to slow down. You start noticing details you wouldn't normally notice. Exits, weaknesses, anything that might help you survive the next few seconds. It isn't something we choose. It's something that happens automatically, the way blinking happens automatically." "And after the danger has passed?" Orun asked. "What then?" "Then you shake," Mara said simply. "Your body lets go of everything it was holding on to. Sometimes you laugh, sometimes you cry, sometimes both at once. It's strange, but by then, the danger is already over, so it doesn't really matter what you feel. What matters is what you did while it was happening." I found myself thinking of my own homeworld, of soft green hills and gentle rivers, of a childhood spent worrying about exam results rather than survival. I had never once needed the kind of calm Mara was describing. I had never once needed my body to decide, faster than my mind could think, whether I would live or not. "There is something else I would like to ask," Professor Orun said, leaning forward slightly. "During your entrance evaluations, your physical results were within normal ranges for your species, according to human medical standards. But your endurance scores, your recovery times after physical strain, they were unusually high compared to species of similar size across the Academy. I assumed at first this was simply individual variation. Now I wonder if it is something more common among your people." "It's fairly common, sir," Mara said. "Humans recover from injury faster than most species expect, given our size. We can also endure extreme temperatures, extreme exhaustion, and extreme hunger for longer than most people assume is possible, though none of it is comfortable. Our bodies were built by a planet that rarely gave us the option to give up." "Built by a planet," Orun repeated quietly, almost to himself. "Not simply surviving one, built by one." That's how I would describe it, sir, Mara said. The professor sat back in his chair, and for a long moment, he said nothing at all. I watched him stare at the old data terminal, its screen still glowing faintly with whatever record he had shown her, and I understood, without needing to be told, that something inside him had shifted permanently. The theory he had mocked at the start of class, the story he had used to make young cadets laugh, had just quietly and firmly become something else entirely, sitting calmly across the desk from him, folding her hands the same way she always did. "Cadet Voss," he said finally, "I would like to bring this matter to the Academy Council. Not to punish you, and not to expose you, but because I believe what you have described changes something important about how this institution understands the galaxy. I would like your permission before I proceed." Mara considered this for a moment, the same careful consideration she gave every question that mattered. "You have my permission, sir," she said, "but I'd ask for one thing in return." "Name it," Orun said. "Don't make this about fear," Mara said. "My species has spent a long time being misunderstood by the people who fear us, and an even longer time being underestimated by the people who don't. I'd rather the Council understood us than feared us. Fear tends to make people do foolish things." Professor Orun studied her for a long moment, his 4 eyes steady, and then, slowly, he nodded. "That," he said, "seems like a very wise request, Cadet Voss. I will do my best to honor it." He gathered the old files from his desk, tucking them carefully under one arm, and rose from his chair with the slow, deliberate movement of someone who had just realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as he had believed that morning. "Both of you are dismissed for today," he said. "Cadet Vel, I trust you will keep what you have heard to yourself until the Council has had a chance to review it properly." "Yes, sir," I said quickly, though even as I said it, I already knew how difficult that promise would be to keep. Word traveled fast through the Academy halls, and 40 cadets had already witnessed Mara raise her hand. It would not take long for questions to spread, whispered from room to room, growing larger and stranger with every retelling, the way all stories do when the truth behind them feels too big to hold quietly. As we left the lecture hall together, Mara glanced at me sideways, her expression calm, almost apologetic. "You don't need to be afraid of me, Kestra," she said quietly. "I know how this looks, but dangerous and threatening aren't the same thing. My planet made me capable of surviving terrible things. It didn't make me want to cause them. I wanted to believe her. Some part of me did believe her, the same part that had shared meals with her, studied beside her, laughed with her during long nights before difficult exams. But another part of me, quieter and more honest, understood that belief and safety were not always the same thing, and that the galaxy I had grown up believing I understood had just become considerably larger and considerably more dangerous than I had ever imagined it to be. We walked the rest of the way to the dormitories in silence, and behind us, in the empty lecture hall, an old professor sat alone with a stack of forgotten files, preparing to tell a council of skeptical officers that the myth they had built their comfort around had just quietly, calmly, and without any drama at all, raised its hand and asked to be believed. 3 days later, the whole academy knew her name. I had expected whispers. What I had not expected was the crowd that gathered outside the main hall the morning the council announced an open review session, open to any cadet who wished to attend. Word had spread exactly the way I feared it would, twisted and stretched with every retelling, until half the academy believed Mara Voss had once fought off a wild predator with her bare hands, and the other half believed the whole thing was an elaborate hoax designed to make humans seem more interesting than they actually were. I arrived early and found a seat near the front, close enough to see everything clearly. The review hall was larger than our usual lecture room, built in tiers so that every cadet could see the floor below, where a long table had been set for 3 council members, Professor Orun among them. Mara sat at a smaller table facing them, alone, her hands folded in that same calm way, as though she were waiting for a routine exam rather than an examination of her entire species. The hall filled quickly. I recognized faces from a dozen different classes, cadets who had never shown any interest in xenobiology, suddenly finding empty seats near the front. Near me sat Priya, a quiet Rendari cadet who studied engineering and rarely spoke unless spoken to first. On my other side, Callum, a broad-shouldered cadet from a heavy-gravity world, leaned forward with his arms crossed, watching Mara with open suspicion. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to nobody in particular. One cadet raises her hand, and suddenly, the whole academy stops working to have a meeting about it. "You could leave," Priya said mildly, without looking at him. Callum did not leave. The council chair, an elderly officer named Director Yasa, rose first, her voice carrying easily across the tiered seating without any need for amplification. "This session is not a trial," she said firmly, looking out over the crowd. "Cadet Voss is not accused of anything. We are here to evaluate a claim that touches on matters of galactic defense classification, and given the number of cadets already discussing this matter informally, the council decided transparency was preferable to rumor." She turned to Mara. "Cadet Voss, you may remain seated. Please answer honestly, and know that nothing said here will be used against you personally. We are interested in facts, not blame." "Understood, Director," Mara said. "Let us begin simply," Yasa said. "Professor Orun has shared with the Council a summary of your homeworld's environmental conditions. Before we proceed further, I would like you to confirm, in your own words, whether that summary is accurate." Mara nodded. "It is accurate, as far as I'm able to judge. If anything, it understates certain details, since some of what I described in class was simplified for a general audience." A murmur ran through the crowd at that. Callum uncrossed his arms slightly, leaning forward with new interest despite himself. "Simplified how?" Yasa asked. "For example," Mara said, "I mentioned predators capable of killing an adult human. I didn't mention that, on my homeworld, there are creatures far too small to see without instruments, that have historically killed more humans than every large predator combined. Nor did I mention that our own planet's weather systems, storms strong enough to level buildings, occur with enough regularity that entire regions of our world have built their calendars around avoiding them. And your species continued to settle in these regions despite the danger?" one of the other council members asked, a stern-faced officer named Tovrik. "We settled everywhere, sir," Mara said. "Every continent, every climate, every extreme our planet had to offer. Some of our ancestors lived through ice ages that reshaped the entire surface of the world. Others lived through droughts that lasted longer than a human lifetime. We didn't choose the safest places to live and stay there. We adapted to wherever we found ourselves, because leaving usually wasn't an option." Tovrik exchanged a glance with Director Yasa before speaking again. "Professor Orun's report mentions a phrase you used in class. You said your species evolved because of the danger, not despite it. I would like you to elaborate on that claim before this council." Mara was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts the way she always did, unhurried, even under the weight of 100 watching eyes. "Every species here today evolved through pressure," she said finally. "That's not unique to humans. What I think is different about Earth is the type and constancy of that pressure. On most worlds represented in this room, from what I've learned in my classes, the environment eventually reached a balance. Predators and prey settled into patterns, climates stabilized. Once a species reached a certain level of intelligence, the world around them stopped actively working against their survival, and they were free to focus on building, rather than simply staying alive." "And Earth did not reach that balance?" Yasa asked. "Earth never stopped trying," Mara said simply. "Every improvement my species made was met with a new challenge. We learned to make fire, and our world gave us storms that could put it out, and cold that made it necessary. We learned to farm, and our world gave us droughts, floods, and countless organisms that fed on our crops before we could. We learned medicine, and diseases evolved alongside us, always finding new ways around whatever cure we developed. It has never once been a battle we won permanently. It has only ever been a battle we were still fighting, generation after generation, right up until we finally left the planet at all. A long silence followed this, broken finally by a cadet near the back of the hall, a sharp-voiced Threllian named Aldrich, who called out without waiting to be recognized. "That's all very poetic," he said, "but words are cheap. Anyone can describe their homeworld as difficult. I'd like to see proof, not a speech." Director Yasa raised a hand, clearly intending to reprimand the interruption, but Mara spoke first. "That's a fair request," she said calmly, turning to face Aldrich directly. "I'd rather answer it than have the council simply take my word for it." She turned back to the council table. "Director, would it be permitted for me to access the Academy's public historical archive? Not classified material, just publicly available human history and biology, the kind any cadet could look up themselves if they were curious enough to search for it." Yasa considered this briefly before nodding. "Granted. Display it for the hall to see, if you wish." A technician near the front activated the large display screen behind the council table, and Mara rose from her seat to approach a terminal at the side of the room. Her fingers moved quickly and precisely across the controls, pulling up records that scrolled past faster than most of us could fully read, though certain phrases lingered long enough to settle uncomfortably in the room. Population loss due to disease events measured not in thousands, but in proportions of the entire species at once. Historical records of ordinary humans surviving falls, injuries, and blood loss that would have ended the lives of most other known species outright. Climate data showing temperature swings across a single planet wider than the total livable range most Academy textbooks used to define a habitable world at all. "These aren't military records," Mara said quietly, as the data continued to scroll. "These are just history books, medical journals, weather reports. This is what an ordinary human education includes before the age of 15. Aldrich, who had demanded proof, had gone very still in his seat. "I want to be clear about something," Mara continued, turning to address the whole hall now rather than just the council. "I'm not telling you this to frighten anyone. My species didn't choose to evolve this way. We didn't ask our planet to be difficult. We simply had no choice but to adapt, the same as every living thing eventually adapts to whatever world it's given. The difference is only in how much adapting was required, and how long the pressure lasted before it ever let up." Director Yasa studied the scrolling records for a long moment before speaking again. "Professor Orun," she said, turning to him, "you mentioned an old classification record during your initial report. I would like it displayed now, formally, for this council and this assembly." Orun rose slowly, retrieving a data slate from beneath the table, and with visible reluctance activated the display. An old document appeared, faded with age, marked with symbols and warnings from a defense era long before any of us had been born. It described, in careful and clinical language, a category of world classified by extreme environmental hostility and a corresponding category of species theorized to emerge from such worlds, marked not by aggression but by an unusually high capacity to endure, adapt, and survive conditions that would eliminate nearly any other form of intelligent life. The final line of the document, displayed clearly for the entire hall to read, stated simply that no confirmed encounter with such a species had been documented, though several unconfirmed reports existed in older, incomplete records that had since been lost or classified beyond current access. The hall was utterly silent, as everyone absorbed what they were reading. "This document," Yasa said slowly, "predates the founding of this academy by a significant margin. It appears our predecessors were aware of this classification and chose, for reasons no longer recorded, to let it fade into legend rather than pursue it further." "Perhaps they were afraid of what they might find," Tavrik said quietly. "Or perhaps," Orun said, "they never found anything at all, because the species in question never revealed itself to them, not until now." Every eye in the hall turned back toward Mara, who stood quietly beside the terminal, her expression as calm and unbothered as it had been since the very first moment she raised her hand in a lecture hall 3 days earlier. "I didn't come here to reveal anything," she said softly. "I came here to study, the same as everyone else in this room. I only answered a question that was asked directly. If nobody had asked, I never would have brought it up." A cadet somewhere in the middle rows, an older student I did not recognize, spoke up in a voice barely above a whisper, though in the silence of the hall, everyone heard it clearly. "This isn't a myth," he said. "This is a warning label." Nobody argued with him. Nobody laughed either. Director Yasa sat back slowly in her chair, studying Mara with an expression that mixed caution with something that looked almost like respect, and for a long moment, the entire hall simply sat in silence, absorbing the shape of a truth none of us had been prepared to hold. Director Yasa called for a recess before the session could continue, and the crowd filed out slowly, murmuring to each other in low voices, none of them quite sure what to make of what they had just witnessed. I lingered near the doorway, uncertain whether to leave with the others or wait, and it was Professor Orun himself who found me there, his expression thoughtful. "Cadet Vel," he said, "walk with me." I fell into step beside him as we made our way down a quiet corridor, away from the crowd, past old portraits of Academy founders and long glass cases displaying artifacts from 100 different worlds. He walked slowly, his claws clicking softly against the polished floor, and for a while he said nothing at all. "You were the one who stayed behind, the day this began," he said eventually. "I imagine you have questions." "Many, sir," I admitted. "Ask them," he said. "I find I no longer have the patience to pretend I know all the answers myself." I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "That old record, the one you showed the council, why was it hidden for so long? If defense forces truly believed a species like this existed, why let it become a myth instead of preparing for it properly?" Orun was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There are two kinds of fear that shape how institutions behave, Cadet Vel. There is the fear that makes us cautious, and there is the fear that makes us foolish. I believe those who buried that record generations ago were afraid in the second way. They did not know how to prepare for something they could not confirm, and so instead of preparing carefully, they chose to forget entirely. It is easier to sleep at night believing monsters are only stories." "But you didn't forget," I said. "You kept the record." "I inherited the record," he corrected gently, "along with a great many other old files nobody else wished to review. I confess I had never taken it seriously myself, until 3 days ago, when a very ordinary cadet raised her hand during a lecture I had given 100 times before, without incident." We reached a small office at the end of the corridor, and Orun gestured for me to sit, as he settled behind an old, cluttered desk covered in data slates and handwritten notes, an old habit, he once told me, from long before digital archives had made such notes unnecessary. "I would like to show you something else," he said, "something I did not present to the council, because I wanted to consider it carefully first." He retrieved a slate from beneath a stack of others and activated it, turning it toward me. The record that appeared was old, older even than the classification document shown earlier, water-damaged in the corners as though it had once been a physical document before being digitized. It described, in brief and fragmented detail, an encounter generations past, an old defense vessel that had responded to a distress signal near an unfamiliar system, only to find the distress signal had been a trap, and the crew that answered it had encountered something the report described only as unusually resilient, unusually resourceful, and, most unsettling of all, unusually reluctant to escalate the conflict once it became clear the threat had been misunderstood. "The report is incomplete," Orun said. "Whoever filed it either lacked the time or the inclination to finish it properly, but there is a note at the bottom, added later, in a different hand." I leaned closer to read it. The note stated simply that the species encountered had shown restraint far beyond what the defense crew's own protocols would have permitted in a similar situation, and recommended, in cautious and deliberately vague language, that any future encounter with a similar species prioritize diplomacy over confrontation, given the apparent capability for overwhelming response should diplomacy fail. "You believe this was humanity," I said slowly. "Even back then." "I cannot be certain," Orun said. "The report never names the species, likely deliberately, given how such information was handled in that era. But the description matches what Cadet Voss has told us, far too closely for me to dismiss it as coincidence. If this is accurate, humanity has encountered other species before, quietly, and chosen restraint each time, without ever announcing themselves as anything other than ordinary." I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb the weight of what he was suggesting. Why would they hide something like that? If they could have shown strength, why not use it to secure a better position for themselves among the rest of the galaxy? Orun considered this for a long moment before answering. I asked Cadet Voss something similar, after the review session concluded, before I found you in the hallway. Her answer was simple, though I have been turning it over in my mind ever since. What did she say? She said her people learned long ago that being feared is not the same as being respected, and that a species capable of frightening others carries a responsibility not to do so carelessly. She said humanity has spent much of its history being underestimated by the very people who should have been most cautious of them, and that they have generally preferred it that way, because being underestimated allows room to be patient, and patience, she said, has always served her species better than power ever could. I thought of Mara as I had known her before all of this began, quiet and polite, sharing her food rations, thanking the cleaning staff every single day without fail. It was difficult to reconcile that image with the ancient warning label Orun had shown to the council, and yet somehow, listening to him now, the two images did not feel as contradictory as I had first believed them to be. "What happens now, sir?" I asked. "Will the council pursue an official reclassification? Will Earth be treated differently because of this?" "I do not know," Orun admitted. "That will not be my decision to make, but I suspect that whatever the council decides, the effects will ripple far beyond this academy. Word of today's session will not stay contained here for long. Other worlds will hear of it eventually, and I imagine reactions will vary considerably, from curiosity to caution to outright alarm, depending on who receives the news and how prepared they already believe themselves to be for such a possibility." He was quiet for a moment, studying the old, water-damaged record still glowing faintly on the slate between us. "I confess something to you, Cadet Vel, that I would not admit before the full council," he said eventually. "When I began teaching Deathworlder theory each year, I did so believing I was teaching a comfortable fiction, something to humble young cadets without ever truly frightening them. I told myself the galaxy had already revealed all its secrets, that nothing so dramatic could still be hiding in plain sight among us. I was wrong, and I find that being wrong in this particular way troubles me more than I expected it to." "Why, sir?" I asked. "If anything, shouldn't this be exciting? A discovery like this, hiding in plain view for so long." "It is exciting," Orun said. "It is also humbling, in a way I have not felt in a very long time. I have taught at this academy for many years, Cadet Vel, and I believed myself to be a careful observer of the galaxy's dangers. And yet a quiet, polite cadet sat in my classroom for months, sharing meals with her classmates, earning average marks in my own subject, all while carrying within her an entire history of survival that would have unsettled every defense strategist across a dozen allied worlds had they only known to ask the right question." He looked at me directly then, his 4 eyes steady and serious. "That is the part that troubles me most," he said. "Not what Cadet Voss is capable of, but how easily her capability could have remained hidden, had circumstances simply unfolded a little differently. If she had not chosen honesty in that moment, if she had simply stayed quiet, as many in her position might have, none of us would be any wiser today. And I find myself wondering how many other quiet, polite cadets might be sitting in classrooms across this academy and others like it, carrying histories none of us have yet thought to ask about. The idea settled over me slowly, heavier the longer I considered it. I thought of every cadet I had ever dismissed as simply ordinary, every quiet student whose homeworld I had never bothered to ask about in any real detail, and I felt a small, uncomfortable chill settle into my chest that had nothing to do with fear of any one species in particular, and everything to do with how little any of us truly understood about the galaxy we all shared. "Cadet Voss," Orun said, almost to himself, setting the old slate down gently on his desk, "you are not what I expected humanity to be. I do not yet know entirely what that means, for this academy, or for the galaxy beyond it, but I suspect we are all about to learn a great deal more than we were prepared for." He rose from his desk then, gathering the scattered files once more, and gestured for me to follow him back toward the corridor. "Come," he said. "The council session will resume shortly, and I suspect the second half will prove considerably more consequential than the first." I followed him out, my mind still turning over everything I had just learned, and somewhere ahead of us, in a hall filling once more with anxious, curious cadets, a quiet human sat calmly waiting for the galaxy to finish deciding what to make of her. The second half of the council session lasted longer than the first, though I remember far less of the specific words spoken. What I remember instead is the shift in the room itself, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Cadets who had leaned forward with suspicion in the morning sat back in their chairs by the afternoon, listening rather than judging. Officers who had spoken with clipped, cautious tones began asking questions that sounded less like interrogation and more like genuine curiosity. Even Callum, who had muttered his complaints beside me at the start of the day, sat in complete silence through the final hour, his arms no longer crossed, his suspicion replaced by something quieter and harder to name. Director Yasa closed the session by announcing that the council would review the classification records formally, consult with Academy leadership on how best to proceed, and issue a formal statement once a decision had been reached. She thanked Mara for her honesty, thanked Professor Orun for bringing the matter forward, and dismissed the assembly with a reminder that nothing discussed that day should be treated as confirmed policy until the council's review was complete. It did not matter. By the time we left the hall, everyone already understood how the story would end. You cannot ask a room full of cadets to unknow something once they have seen it clearly, and we had all seen it clearly enough. The following weeks passed strangely. The Academy did not announce any dramatic changes right away, but small differences began appearing in ways that were impossible to miss if you were paying attention, and after that day, I found myself paying attention to almost everything. Our xenobiology course was the first to change. Professor Orun revised his lecture on Deathworlder theory within the month, no longer presenting it as a discarded myth, but as an active area of ongoing study, one with at least one confirmed and several suspected cases requiring careful, respectful research rather than dismissive folklore. He never used Mara's name directly in his lectures, out of respect for her privacy, but everyone in the room understood exactly which case he meant whenever he spoke of it. New coursework appeared soon after, an elective titled Extreme Environment Adaptation, taught jointly by Professor Orun and a visiting instructor from the medical faculty. I enrolled in it out of curiosity, along with Priya, who had grown quietly fascinated by the whole affair despite her usual reluctance to show much interest in anything outside her engineering studies. "I keep thinking about the numbers," she told me one evening, as we studied together in the common room of our dormitory. "The math doesn't work the way it should. A species shouldn't be able to survive that level of constant pressure and still develop complex civilization. There should have been a point where the pressure simply won." "Maybe there almost was," I said. "More than once, probably." Priya considered this, tapping her stylus thoughtfully against her datapad. "That's what unsettles me most, honestly. Not that they survived. It's that they survived by such a narrow margin, over and over, for so long, that surviving eventually became simply what they were built to do. It stopped being an achievement and became an identity. I thought about that phrase often in the weeks that followed. It stopped being an achievement and became an identity. It seemed to explain something important about the way Mara carried herself, calm through moments that would have unsettled nearly anyone else, patient in ways that made sense only once you understood just how much patience her ancestors had needed simply to make it through an ordinary week. The other cadets treated her differently after that day, though not in the way I might have expected. There was no widespread fear, no crowds parting nervously whenever she walked through the corridors. If anything, the change was quieter and stranger than that. Cadets who had barely noticed her before began greeting her by name in the hallways. Younger students, particularly first years still adjusting to academy life, began seeking her out during study sessions, drawn by a kind of curious respect that had nothing to do with rank or reputation. Aldrich, the sharp-voiced cadet who had demanded proof during the council session, approached her one afternoon in the training yard while I happened to be nearby practicing formation drills with my own squad. I watched the exchange carefully, half expecting some lingering hostility between them. "I owe you an apology," Aldrich said stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the words, even as he said them. "I spoke out of turn during the session. I assumed you were exaggerating for attention." "You don't owe me anything," Mara said easily. "You asked a fair question. I'd rather people ask than simply assume." "Even so," Aldrich said, "I misjudged you. I won't do it again." Mara offered him a small, genuine smile. "Then we're square. Truthfully, I'd rather be doubted honestly than believed blindly. Doubt at least means people are paying attention." He nodded, clearly relieved the conversation had gone more easily than he expected, and left without further comment. I found myself smiling slightly as I watched him go, struck again by how effortlessly Mara managed to diffuse tension that would have left most cadets, myself included, feeling awkward and unsettled for days afterward. The council's formal statement arrived nearly 2 months after the initial session, delivered not with fanfare, but as a quiet update circulated through official academy channels. It confirmed, in careful and measured language, that historical evidence strongly suggested humanity met the environmental and biological criteria for what the old, discontinued classification system had once termed a Deathworld origin species. It recommended further study, urged caution and respect in future diplomatic engagements involving human representatives, and specifically noted, in a line I read several times over before I fully believed it, that humanity's demonstrated preference for restraint and diplomacy, despite significant theoretical capacity for escalation, should be regarded as a point of reassurance rather than concern. I read that statement standing in the dormitory corridor, surrounded by other cadets doing the same, and I remember the particular quiet that settled over all of us as we absorbed what it meant. It was not the quiet of fear, though a trace of that remained, buried somewhere beneath the surface. It was closer to the quiet that comes from genuinely reconsidering something you believed you understood completely, only to realize you had barely understood it at all. That evening, I found Mara alone in the training yard, later than most cadets usually stayed out, sitting on a low wall and watching the last of the daylight fade behind the academy's outer towers. I hesitated before approaching, uncertain whether she would want company, but she glanced up and offered a small nod, an invitation more than a greeting, and I sat down beside her. "You read the statement," she said, not quite a question. "Everyone has," I said. "It's the only thing anyone's talking about." She nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on the darkening sky. "I imagine it will be the only thing a lot of people talk about, for a while at least. It's strange, being the reason for that. I never wanted attention. I just wanted to study, the same as everyone else here." I considered my next question carefully before asking it, unsure whether it was appropriate, but curiosity won out over caution. "Can I ask you something, honestly? Why didn't you say anything sooner? You must have known, the whole time you've been here, exactly what your homeworld was. You could have mentioned it on your very first day, if you wanted to." Mara was quiet for a moment, considering the question the same careful way she considered everything. "We don't usually bring it up," she said eventually, "unless someone asks directly. It isn't a secret, exactly. It's more that humans learned a long time ago that talking about how dangerous your own homeworld is tends to make people uncomfortable, even when you don't mean it that way. Nobody wants to sit next to the person who casually mentions surviving things that would terrify most people simply by existing. It changes how people treat you, usually for the worse, even when they don't intend it." "So you just never mentioned it," I said. "For months." "It never came up in a way that required an honest answer," she said. "Professor Orun asked a direct question in class that day. I could have stayed quiet, the way I usually do when the subject edges close to it, but it felt wrong somehow to let an entire lecture pass built on the assumption that something like us couldn't exist, when I was sitting right there the whole time, knowing otherwise." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the last traces of color fade from the sky above the academy towers. "Doesn't it bother you," I asked finally, "that people will look at you differently now? That they'll always wonder what you're capable of, even when you're just sitting quietly, doing nothing at all?" Mara considered this with the same patient stillness she brought to everything. "It used to bother me more than it does now," she admitted, "but I've come to think there's something almost useful in it, strange as that sounds. People pay closer attention to things they respect, even cautiously. And attention, used well, tends to lead to understanding eventually, if you're patient enough to wait for it." "And if it doesn't?" I asked. "If people only ever see the danger, and never bother looking past it?" "Then that's their choice to make," she said simply. "I can't control how people choose to see me. I can only control how I actually behave, day to day, and trust that eventually the behavior speaks louder than the reputation. It usually does, given enough time." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the academy grounds quiet around us, most cadets already indoors for the evening. I found myself thinking about everything that had changed since that ordinary morning in Xenobiology 400, the joke that had stopped being a joke, the myth that had quietly, calmly raised its hand and asked to be taken seriously. "Can I tell you something?" I said eventually. "I was afraid of you, at first. After the review session, I kept thinking about everything you described, all those numbers, all that history, and I couldn't stop imagining what it would mean if a species like that ever decided the rest of us weren't worth its patience." Mara turned to look at me then, her expression gentle rather than offended. "That's a fair thing to feel," she said. "I'd rather you tell me honestly than pretend otherwise. Most people who understand the danger clearly enough to be afraid of it are usually smart enough not to provoke it carelessly. That's not a bad outcome, in the long run." "And now?" she asked. "Do you still feel that way?" I considered the question seriously before answering, unwilling to give a false answer, simply to be polite. "A little," I admitted, "but less than I did. I think what changed it wasn't the numbers, or the old records, or even the council's statement. It was watching you apologize to Aldrich today, when he was the one who owed you an apology instead. It was watching you choose patience, every single time, when nobody would have blamed you for choosing something else." Mara smiled slightly at that, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes in a way I had rarely seen from her before. "That's the part most people miss, when they only look at the numbers," she said. "Deathworlder isn't really about how dangerous a species can be. Anyone dangerous enough can cause harm, given the opportunity. What actually matters is what a species chooses to do with that danger, once it has the power to act on it freely. My people learned a long time ago that surviving a hostile world doesn't mean you have to become hostile yourself. If anything, most of us learned the opposite. We learned exactly how much a little kindness matters, once you've seen firsthand how easily everything can be taken away." I sat with that thought for a long while after she said it, turning it over slowly, and somewhere in that quiet academy evening, surrounded by the fading light and the distant sound of cadets settling in for the night, I finally understood something I suspect I will carry with me for the rest of my career among the stars. The galaxy is full of dangerous things, storms and predators, diseases and disasters, weapons built by careless hands, and accidents born from simple misfortune. But the most dangerous thing I ever encountered at that academy was not a weapon, or a monster, or a myth brought suddenly and frighteningly to life. It was a quiet, patient cadet who thanked the cleaning staff every single day without fail, who shared her food rations without being asked, who apologized when she had nothing to apologize for, and who chose, again and again, in 100 small ordinary moments nobody else was watching closely enough to notice, to be kind, simply because she could have chosen otherwise, and decided, every single time, that she would not. That, I have come to believe, is what truly frightened the rest of us most, once the shock of that first afternoon finally settled. Not that humanity could be dangerous. We had already learned to accept that much, given enough time and enough evidence. What frightened us, quietly and permanently, was realizing that a species capable of so much danger had chosen, over and over again, across an entire history longer and harder than most of us could properly imagine, to be gentle instead. And somewhere in that realization, buried beneath the fear and the caution and the endless careful study that followed, I found something I had not expected to find at all. I found that I trusted her more, not less, for everything I had learned, and I suspected, watching the last light fade over the Academy towers that evening, that in time, the rest of the galaxy would come to feel exactly the same way.